The dust kicked up by Sarah Mitchell's worn boots settled slowly in the Arizona heat as she approached the trading post. Her calloused hands gripped the reins of her horse tighter than necessary, betraying the nervousness she refused to show on her face. The sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier settlement, and sweat beaded on her forehead beneath the brim of her father's old hat. Sarah had been traveling for 3 days straight, stopping only when her horse needed rest. The letter in her saddlebag felt like it weighed more than her entire pack. News of her brother's death had reached her at the ranch in Colorado, along with word that his killer was being held at Fort Apache, awaiting execution. The trading post was busier than she expected for such a remote location. Soldiers in dusty blue uniforms mingled with local ranchers and a few Chiricahua Apache who had come to trade. Sarah tied her horse to the hitching post and pushed through the wooden doors, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of leather and coffee. She approached the grizzled man behind the counter, his gray beard stained with years of chewing tobacco. "I'm looking for information about Fort Apache," she said, keeping her voice steady. The man looked her up and down, taking in her trail-worn clothes and the determination in her green eyes. "You got business at the fort, miss?" "My name is Sarah Mitchell. My brother was Thomas Mitchell, the surveyor who was killed 3 weeks ago." A hush fell over the nearby conversations. The old man's expression softened slightly. "I heard about that. Real sorry for your loss, miss. Your brother was a good man, always fair in his dealings." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I didn't come here for condolences. I came to see justice done." "Justice is already being served, miss. They caught the one who did it, Apache brave named Nalnish. He'll hang within the week." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow, though she couldn't say why. She had expected to feel satisfaction at learning her brother's killer would pay for his crime. Instead, she felt hollow. "I want to see him," she said quietly. "Ma'am, I want to see the man who killed my brother, before they hang him." The trader exchanged glances with several other men in the store. "That ain't exactly common, miss. Why would you want to do such a thing?" Sarah wasn't entirely sure herself. Something about the whole situation felt incomplete, like a story with missing pages. Thomas had been working as a surveyor for the territorial government, mapping Apache lands for potential railroad development. He was supposed to be protected by a small cavalry escort. How had one Apache brave managed to kill him and escape, only to be captured days later? "That's my business," she replied firmly. An old Apache man sitting in the corner had been listening quietly. He stood slowly, his weathered hands resting on a walking stick carved from juniper wood. "Miss Mitchell," he said in careful English, "I knew your brother. He was respectful man, fair man." Sarah turned to face him, studying the lines etched deep in his bronze face. "You knew Thomas?" "Yes. He came to our camp several times. Always asked permission before crossing our lands. Always shared his food when he stayed." The old man paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "The one they have at the fort. Nalnish. He was not enemy of your brother." "What do you mean?" "Nalnish spoke often of the surveyor with respect. Said he was different from other white men. Said he listened when Apache people spoke." A chill ran down Sarah's spine, despite the desert heat. "Are you saying he didn't do it?" The old Apache man was quiet for a long moment. "I am saying only what I know. Nalnish had no reason to kill Thomas Mitchell. They had spoken together many times in peace." The trader interrupted. "Now hold on there, Joe. The Army found Nalnish with Mitchell's surveying equipment. They found horse tracks leading from the murder site right to the Apache camp. Evidence don't lie." The Apache elder, apparently called Joe by the whites, nodded slowly. "Evidence can be like shadows in firelight. Sometimes it shows truth. Sometimes it shows only what someone wants you to see. Sarah felt her world tilting slightly. She had ridden 3 days fueled by grief and rage, certain that seeing her brother's killer would somehow provide closure. Now doubt crept in like smoke under a door. "I need to get to Fort Apache," she said. "How far?" "2 days hard ride north," the trader replied. "But miss, you might want to think twice about this. Seeing a man before his execution? Well, it ain't pleasant for a lady." Sarah's eyes flashed. "I've seen death before. I've buried my parents and now my brother. Don't assume I'm some delicate flower because I wear a dress under these trail clothes." She purchased supplies for the journey north, her mind churning with questions. As she prepared to leave, the Apache elder approached her again. "Miss Mitchell," he said quietly, "if you go to the fort, ask them to let you speak with Nalnish. Ask him to tell you about the last time he saw your brother. Ask him about the warning." Warning? What warning? But Joe had already turned away, walking slowly toward the door. He paused at the threshold. Sometimes the real enemy hides behind the badge of a friend. 2 days later, Sarah rode through the gates of Fort Apache as the sun began to set behind the surrounding mountains. The fort was larger than she had expected, with several wooden buildings arranged around a central parade ground. Soldiers moved about their evening duties, some pausing to stare at the lone woman on horseback. She was directed to the commanding officer's quarters, where she found Colonel James Harrison reviewing reports by lamplight. He was a man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Miss Mitchell, I presume?" he said, rising from behind his desk. "I received word you might be coming. Please accept my condolences for your loss. Your brother was well regarded among my men." "Thank you, Colonel. I've come to request permission to speak with the Apache prisoner before his execution." Colonel Harrison frowned. "That's a most unusual request, Miss Mitchell. May I ask why you would want to subject yourself to such an ordeal?" Sarah had rehearsed this conversation during her ride to the fort. "I need to hear from his own lips what happened to my brother. I need to understand why." The colonel studied her for a long moment. "Miss Mitchell, I understand your grief, but speaking with Nalnish won't bring your brother back. The man is a savage who murdered Thomas in cold blood. Nothing he says can justify that." "I'm not looking for justification, Colonel. I'm looking for truth. The truth was established at his trial. The evidence was overwhelming." "What trial?" Sarah asked. "I was told he confessed." A brief flicker of something crossed the colonel's face. He admitted his guilt, yes. A trial wasn't necessary." Sarah felt that chill again. "I'd like to see the evidence, if I may." Colonel Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Mitchell, with all due respect, you're not a law officer or a territorial official. The case is closed. But surely there's no harm in letting me speak with him. If he's guilty, what could he possibly say that would change anything?" The colonel stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Very well. But I warn you, the Apache are cunning. They'll say anything to avoid the rope. Don't let his lies dishonor your brother's memory." As Sarah left the colonel's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something much more complex and dangerous than a simple case of murder and justice. The shadows were growing longer, both outside in the fort's courtyard and in her understanding of what had really happened to Thomas. The guard led her toward the stockade, where Nalnish awaited his fate. With each step, Sarah felt the weight of questions that needed answers, and the growing certainty that the truth was buried deeper than anyone wanted to admit. The stockade was a grim wooden structure at the far end of the fort, guarded by 2 young soldiers who looked barely old enough to shave. They straightened when they saw Sarah approaching with their sergeant. "Open it up, boys," the sergeant ordered. "Lady wants to speak with the prisoner." The heavy wooden door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo Sarah's own apprehension. Inside, the cell was dimly lit by a single oil lamp hanging from a beam. The smell of unwashed bodies and despair hung heavy in the air. Nalnish sat on a rough wooden bench against the far wall, his hands shackled with iron chains. He looked up as Sarah entered, and she was struck by his eyes. She had expected to see the cold gaze of a killer, but instead found intelligence and something that looked almost like resignation. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps in his early 30s, with long black hair and the lean build of someone who had spent his life in the wilderness. A purple bruise spread across his left cheekbone, and his lower lip was split and scabbed over. "You are Thomas Mitchell's sister," he said in English that was accented but clear. It wasn't a question. Sarah found herself momentarily speechless. She had prepared angry words, demands for explanations, accusations, but faced with this man in chains, waiting to die, the words stuck in her throat. "Yes," she finally managed. "I am Sarah Mitchell." Nalnish nodded slowly. "You look like him around the eyes. Same green color. Same way of watching everything." "I didn't come here to chat about family resemblances," Sarah said, finding her voice. "I came to hear you admit what you did to my brother." "What I did to your brother?" Nalnish's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your brother saved my daughter's life 2 months ago. What I did was mourn his death like I would mourn the death of my own family." The words hit Sarah like a slap. "That's a lie. Your brother found my daughter, Ayana, when she had fallen from her horse and broken her leg. He could have ridden past. White men have done so before, leaving our people to die. Instead, he made a splint for her leg and carried her back to our camp. He stayed 2 days to make sure the bone was setting properly." Sarah felt her certainty beginning to crumble. "If that's true, then why are you here? Why do they say you killed him?" Nalnish was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face. "Sergeant Murphy and Private Collins were with your brother when he died. Ask them what happened." "I'm asking you." "I was not there when Thomas died. I found his body 3 days later, along with his surveying equipment scattered in the rocks. I gathered his tools because they were valuable and because I thought his family should have them back." Nalnish's voice was steady, without the desperation she might have expected from a condemned man. "That is when the soldiers found me. The soldiers said you confessed." A bitter smile crossed Nalnish's face. "After 3 days of questioning, many men will confess to anything. The soldiers were persuasive." Sarah noticed now that the bruises on his face weren't the only marks of violence. His shirt was torn, revealing older bruises on his ribs and arms. "Why should I believe you?" "Because your brother trusted me enough to tell me about the danger he was in." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What danger?" "Thomas discovered something in his surveying work. Something he was not supposed to find. He told me there were men who wanted him to change his maps, to show land as unsuitable for railroad development when it was actually perfect for it." "That doesn't make sense. Why would anyone want to stop railroad development?" Nalnish leaned forward slightly, his chains clinking. "Not stop it. Control it. If certain men could buy the land cheap because the official surveys showed it as worthless, then later reveal it as valuable." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. They'd make a fortune. "Your brother refused to falsify his maps. He told me he had evidence of the conspiracy, proof that certain officials were involved. He said he was going to report it to the territorial governor." Sarah sank onto a wooden crate that served as a chair, her mind reeling. "Who? Who was involved?" "I do not know all the names, but Thomas mentioned Colonel Harrison. He said the colonel had approached him directly, offering money for altered maps. The cell seemed to spin around Sarah. Colonel Harrison, the man who had just granted her permission to see Nalnish, the man who had insisted on the prisoner's guilt without a trial. "There's more," Nalnish continued. "Thomas told me he had hidden his real maps and his evidence somewhere safe. He said if anything happened to him, I should tell his family to look for the truth in the place where eagles nest above the sacred spring." "Where eagles nest above the sacred spring? What does that mean?" "I do not know. It was his message, not mine." Sarah sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing everything she had heard. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the fort settling into evening routines, soldiers calling to each other, horses nickering in the corrals. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked. "Why not tell the authorities?" "What authorities? The colonel who wanted your brother to lie? The territorial officials who may be part of the conspiracy?" Nalnish shook his head. "I am Apache. My word means nothing to white man's law, but you are Thomas's sister. You might be able to find his evidence and see justice done. Even if what you're saying is true, it doesn't prove you didn't kill him." "No," Nalnish agreed quietly. "It does not prove that. But ask yourself this. If I killed Thomas for his surveying equipment, why would I know about his troubles with the colonel? Why would I know about hidden evidence? Why would a killer help his victim's sister find proof of other crimes?" Sarah had no answer for that. Every rational part of her mind told her not to trust this man, not to believe his story. But something deeper, some instinct she couldn't name, whispered that he was telling the truth. "There is something else," Nalnish said. "The day before Thomas died, he came to our camp. He seemed frightened, more frightened than I had ever seen him. He said he thought someone was following him, someone who meant him harm. He asked if he could leave something with us for safekeeping." "What did he leave?" "A sealed envelope. He gave it to my wife with instructions that it should only be opened by his family if something happened to him." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Where is this envelope?" "My wife hid it in our camp. But the soldiers arrested me before I could tell them about it. Now they will not let me send word to my people." "Tell me where to find your wife." Nalnish gave her detailed directions to the Apache camp, warning her that approaching as a white woman alone would be dangerous unless she could prove she came on his behalf. "Tell my wife you spoke with me. Tell her I said, 'The mountain lion watches over the sleeping fawn.' She will know this comes from me and she will help you." As Sarah prepared to leave, Nalnish called her name softly. She turned back to see him watching her with those intelligent dark eyes. "Your brother was a good man, Sarah Mitchell. He did not deserve to die for trying to do what was right. If you find his evidence, if you expose the truth, his death will not be meaningless." Sarah left the stockade with her head spinning and her heart heavy. As she walked back across the fort's parade ground, she noticed Colonel Harrison watching her from his office window. When their eyes met, he quickly stepped back into the shadows. That night, lying on a narrow cot in the fort's guest quarters, Sarah stared at the ceiling and wrestled with impossible decisions. Tomorrow, Nalnish would hang. If he was telling the truth, an innocent man would die while the real killers went free. If he was lying, she might be about to risk her life chasing phantoms across the Arizona desert. But as she thought about Thomas, about the brother who had raised her after their parents died, who had taught her to be strong and independent and to always stand up for what was right, she knew what she had to do. She would find Nalnish's wife. She would locate Thomas's hidden evidence. And if a conspiracy had killed her brother, she would expose it, no matter what the cost. As dawn approached, Sarah began planning her escape from Fort Apache. She didn't know who she could trust, but she knew she couldn't trust the colonel. And with Nalnish's execution scheduled for sunset, time was running out for both justice and the truth. Sarah slipped out of Fort Apache before dawn, leading her horse on foot until she was well beyond the sentry's hearing, before mounting and riding hard toward the Apache camp. The morning air was crisp and filled with the scent of sage and juniper as she followed Nalnish's directions through rocky canyons and across dry creek beds. She found the camp hidden in a fold of red rock hills, a collection of traditional wickiups, and a few canvas shelters scattered around a clear spring. Dogs barked at her approach, and Apache men emerged with rifles ready. Sarah raised her hands slowly, showing she was unarmed. "I need to speak with Nalnish's wife," she called out in English, hoping someone would understand. "I have a message from him." An elderly Apache woman stepped forward, her gray hair braided with strips of leather. She spoke rapidly in Apache to the men with guns, then turned to Sarah with suspicious eyes. "I am Nalnish's mother-in-law," she said in broken English. "Who are you?" "I am Sarah Mitchell, sister of Thomas Mitchell, the surveyor. Nalnish told me to say that the mountain lion watches over the sleeping fawn." The woman's expression changed immediately from suspicion to something like hope. She spoke again in Apache, and a younger woman emerged from one of the shelters. This had to be Nalnish's wife. The younger woman approached cautiously, her dark eyes studying Sarah's face. "You have seen my husband?" "Yes, yesterday evening. He's scheduled to hang today at sunset." Pain flashed across the woman's features, but she composed herself quickly. "What did he tell you?" Sarah explained about the envelope Thomas had left, about the conspiracy Nalnish had described, about the evidence that might prove his innocence. As she spoke, more Apache gathered to listen, their faces grave. Nalnish's wife, who introduced herself as Desba, nodded slowly when Sarah finished. "Yes, your brother left something with us, but he also said something else. Something my husband may not have remembered to tell you." She led Sarah to a sheltered area near the spring where they could speak privately. "Your brother said if anything happened to him, his sister should know that the answer lies where the eagle nests above the sacred spring. But he also drew a map." Desba disappeared into her wickiup and returned with a piece of folded paper. "He drew this before he left. He said it would guide his family to the truth." Sarah unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was a rough sketch showing a series of landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a dead tree with lightning damage, and finally an X marked near what looked like a cliff face with a spring at its base. "This sacred spring," Sarah said, studying the map. "Is it far from here?" "Half-day's ride north, but dangerous country. Steep cliffs, easy to fall." Desba hesitated. "The place where eagles nest, there are caves in the cliff above the spring. Ancient caves where our ancestors once sheltered. If your brother hid something there, it would be well hidden. Will you help me find it?" Desba looked toward the direction of Fort Apache, as if she could see through the miles of desert to where her husband waited for death. "Yes, for Nalnish, and for your brother, who was good to our people." They set out immediately. Desba leading on a sure-footed Apache pony while Sarah followed on her larger horse. The sun climbed higher as they rode through increasingly rugged terrain, the desert giving way to pine-covered hills and rocky canyons. By midday, they reached the sacred spring, a clear pool fed by water seeping from the red rock cliff face above. Sarah could see why it was considered sacred. In the harsh desert landscape, this oasis felt like a miracle. Above them, the cliff face rose nearly 100 feet, riddled with caves and ledges. Sarah spotted at least 3 eagle nests on the highest reachable ledge. "There," Desba pointed. "That is where the eagles nest. But the climb—" Sarah studied the cliff face. It would be dangerous, especially for someone not used to rock climbing. But she had grown up scrambling over the rocky hills around her family's ranch in Colorado. She could make the climb. I have to try, she said. The climb took nearly an hour, with Sarah carefully picking her way up hand and footholds worn smooth by centuries of weather. Twice she nearly slipped, saved only by finding secure grips at the last moment. When she finally reached the eagle's ledge, her hands were bleeding and her heart was pounding. The cave behind the nests was shallow but dry. Sarah had to crawl to enter it fully, and at first she thought it was empty. Then, feeling along the back wall, her fingers found something that didn't belong, a metal box wedged into a crack in the rock. She pulled it free and crawled back to the cave mouth, where she could examine it in the light. It was a surveyor's instrument box, battered but still intact. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, she found a thick bundle of papers and maps. The descent was even more treacherous than the climb up, but eventually Sarah made it back to solid ground with the box clutched safely against her chest. Desba helped her spread the contents on a flat rock beside the spring. What they found was devastating. Thomas's real survey maps showed vast areas marked as unsuitable for development on the official versions were actually perfect for railroad construction, with gentle grades, solid ground, and easy access to water. There were also detailed notes in Thomas's handwriting documenting conversations with Colonel Harrison and two territorial officials, dates and amounts of money offered for falsified maps. But the most damning evidence was a series of letters. One, signed by Colonel Harrison, detailed the conspiracy explicitly. Another, from a territorial land commissioner, outlined plans to purchase the worthless land through intermediaries, then resell it to the railroad at enormous profit once the false surveys were replaced with accurate ones. Sarah felt sick as she read the final letter in the bundle. It was from Thomas to her, dated the day before his death. Dear Sarah, if you are reading this, then my fears have proven justified. I have discovered corruption that reaches high into the territorial government. Colonel Harrison has threatened me, and I believe my life is in danger. I have refused to falsify my surveys, and I fear that refusal may cost me everything. The evidence in this box should be enough to expose the conspiracy and see justice done. Trust no one at Fort Apache. Colonel Harrison has men loyal to him who will kill to keep this secret. I pray you never have to read this letter, but if you do, please see that the truth comes to light. Your loving brother, Thomas. We have to get this evidence to someone we can trust, Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion and rage. Someone outside the conspiracy. First, we must save Nalnish, Desba replied firmly. Sunset comes soon. Sarah looked at the position of the sun and realized with horror that they had been gone most of the day. It would be nearly sunset by the time they could ride back to Fort Apache, and Nalnish was scheduled to hang at sunset. They rode harder than Sarah had ever ridden in her life, pushing their horses to the limit across the rough terrain. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they could see the fort in the distance. Smoke was rising from the parade ground, and Sarah's heart sank as she realized they might be seeing smoke from the cooking fires for Nalnish's last meal. They thundered through the fort's gates just as the sun touched the mountains. Soldiers scattered as Sarah and Desba rode straight toward the gallows that had been erected in the center of the parade ground. A crowd had gathered, and Sarah could see Nalnish standing on the platform with a rope around his neck. Colonel Harrison stood nearby, checking his pocket watch. When he saw Sarah approaching, his face went pale. "Stop!" Sarah shouted, leaping from her horse before it had completely stopped. "Stop the execution! I have proof this man is innocent!" She held up the surveyor's box, the damning letters clutched in her other hand. Thomas Mitchell discovered a conspiracy to defraud the territorial government. Colonel Harrison is involved. Nalnish didn't kill my brother. The crowd murmured in confusion and excitement. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his hand moving to his side arm. "Miss Mitchell, you're obviously distraught. This Apache killed your brother. Don't dishonor Thomas's memory with these wild accusations." Thomas left evidence, Sarah shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. Letters proving Colonel Harrison offered him bribes to falsify survey maps, documents showing a conspiracy to defraud the railroad. My brother was killed because he refused to participate. She began reading from Harrison's letter, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground. As the details of the conspiracy became clear, angry murmurs arose from the gathered soldiers and civilians. Colonel Harrison drew his pistol. That's enough. Miss Mitchell is obviously delusional with grief. Sergeant Murphy, proceed with the execution. But Sergeant Murphy made no move toward the gallows lever. Instead, he stared at Colonel Harrison with dawning understanding. Sir, if what she's saying is true, it's lies. All of it, Sarah continued reading, document after document, each one more damning than the last. When she reached Thomas's final letter describing Harrison's threats, several soldiers stepped away from the colonel. You killed my brother, didn't you? Sarah said, her voice now deadly quiet. Or you had him killed, because he wouldn't help you steal from the territory. Harrison's face was white with rage. You have no proof of murder. Those documents could be forgeries. The handwriting can be verified, the signatures can be checked against official records, and there will be other evidence once investigators start looking. Sarah stepped closer to the platform where Nalnish still stood with the noose around his neck. But most importantly, you have no evidence this man committed murder. You have his alleged confession, beaten out of him. You have surveying equipment he admits to picking up from the scene. But you have no witnesses, no real proof. The territorial judge who had arrived to witness the execution stepped forward. Colonel Harrison, in light of these serious allegations, I'm ordering a stay of execution pending a full investigation. Harrison's hand tightened on his pistol. And for a moment, Sarah thought he might try to shoot his way out of the situation, but too many people had heard too much. The conspiracy was exposed, and killing her now would only confirm his guilt. The colonel slowly holstered his weapon and stepped back, his shoulders sagging in defeat. As the noose was removed from Nalnish's neck and his chains unlocked, he looked directly at Sarah. Your brother would be proud, he said simply. Sarah felt tears running down her face. Tears of grief for Thomas, relief for Nalnish, and something like satisfaction that justice would finally be done. Spare me your sympathy, she had told the old Apache man at the trading post when he offered condolences for her loss. But standing there in the fading light, watching an innocent man freed and knowing her brother's killers would face justice, she realized she didn't need sympathy. She had something better, the truth and the knowledge that Thomas's death had not been in vain. Colonel Harrison was arrested that evening, along with 2 territorial officials whose names appeared in the conspiracy documents. The investigation that followed exposed corruption reaching high into the territorial government and led to significant reforms in land development oversight. Nalnish returned to his family, and Sarah stayed in Arizona long enough to testify at the trials that followed. She kept one of Thomas's survey maps, the one showing the true value of the land he had died protecting. Years later, when the railroad finally came through, it followed exactly the route Thomas had originally mapped, bringing prosperity to the territory while preserving the areas sacred to the Apache people. As she finally rode away from Arizona, Sarah carried with her not just the satisfaction of justice served, but the knowledge that sometimes the real enemy does indeed hide behind the badge of a friend, and sometimes the truth can only be found by those brave enough to climb where eagles nest above sacred springs.